All right. This is Marte from Community Movement Builders. And with us today is Kwame. Could you introduce yourself, Kwame?
Peace, everybody. My name is Kwame. I am the Cooperative Director for Community Movement Builders and also just do general organizing within the organization as well. So, yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Today, we're basically going to be talking about cooperatives, some of the history and the way that they function within CMB, as well as how they can be used by revolutionaries and a lot of other questions of that manner. So definitely to start with, you got to get the basic context down first, right? So the first question really is for you, Kwame, is what is a cooperative in your eyes?
Yeah, absolutely. So, how we envision cooperatives and what we do with the cooperatives, essentially, when we're organizing, there's theory and there's praxis, right? We're organizing around building out socialism. We're a socialist organization, and a lot of people will have theories all day about which particular socialist theory there is, but what we also need to be thinking about is how do we practically build these things out in community today. And so, where we come from, when we're thinking about building out cooperatives, it's an economic model that while we're living under capitalism, while we're living under in the United States of America with three Ks, we have to be able to figure out how we can also, live within this, be able to fight against that system in a practical sense, right? And so one of those ways that we do that from an economic standpoint is building out worker-owned cooperatives. Now, generally, a cooperative is a system in which you can build out, you can build out businesses, for example, but in a way that's opposed to the private ownership model of building business, right? So you have instead of just having investors or people who are not actually performing any labor own the means of production, own the labor, and own and get all the profits from the labor that's being produced. A cooperative system is where the workers who are actually producing the labor, who are actually producing the goods themselves, have ownership over all of the mechanisms within the company, for example, right? So I always like to use an example. Let's say you have a business, and that business you have 10 employees, and each of the 10 employees, they might have a salary that's still within a cooperative model, but but each employee equally contributes to the work that's being performed, and at the end of the year, $100 worth of profit is obtained through the company, right? And let's say each one of those 10 employees is paid $1 for a wage, right? This is very simple, very basic, just to make this math easy. So in a normal company, that $100 that's made at the end of the day, $10 of that will go to the wages of those 10 employees, and then $90 of that profit will go to the capitalist, right? It will go to the person who owns the means of production, right? The investors into the company, whatever it might be. In a cooperative model, those 10 people, let's say they equally contributed to that company, they still get their $10 wage or that they had, but then at the end of the year, that $100 profit or the 90 additional dollars that are outside of the wages get split up evenly between those 10 people who contributed to that labor. So now, instead of those 10 people who made that those $100 worth of profit, each of them will receive the $10 paid out to them, because they are the ones who actually perform that labor to be able to produce those profits. So we're thinking through ways and mechanisms to be able to build out systems that are opposed to capitalism and actually value the labor that folks are putting into the work that they're doing.
Makes sense. So it is a different type of form of of running a specific business than there is in typical, capitalism. It kind of seems, yeah. Um, and that brings me to the next question, which is a little bit more specific, and this really has to do with our organization, right? So I wanted to ask if you could talk about what Community Movement Builders is doing around cooperative organizing.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we have a few different cooperatives that we are, still creating. Is a lot of kind of like details that go into it because we live in a capitalistic country. um, Not every state, but each state has different laws concerning, what you can, like, even if they recognize cooperatives, right? Where we are right now in Atlanta and Georgia, the state of Georgia actually doesn't recognize cooperatives. So we have to navigate some of those legal ramifications about how we actually implement those. But it's definitely doable, and we do it. But we have a few different businesses that we have where some that we're in the ideation phase of, some that we're building, and some that we actually have in our running currently. The one that we have most developed right now is our cooperative around CMOS, right? It's called Community CMOS. That's the brand that it's named. And we actually we purchase bulk wholesale CMOS. We package that up. We distribute it to a few different uh, stores in the local Metro Atlanta area. And we also, so that's the CMOS plant as well, but we also process CMOS gel, and we distribute that out to those same locations. We can be found in Nuts and Berries and in Seven Nanda, and we also sell it online as well on our website. So that's the one that's the most advanced that we have actually two worker owners that are in our what we're building out to be the liberated zone of Pittsburgh, Atlanta, the neighborhood in South Atlanta, Pittsburgh. And yeah, we're currently building that out and making it so that we can expand that as well. We have a couple others, another one as well, which is aquaponics. That's one is more so in the building phase, right? We already have the idea. We've already purchased some of the material to be able to start building this out. We're in the process of actually growing some of the produce and the fish that we'll be growing. And so for folks who don't know what aquaponics is, because I'll be real, when I first started, I didn't know what aquaponics was. It's like a symbiotic relationship to be able to sustainably grow both fish and also produce, right? So the way it works is you'll have a tank, like kind of like a fish tank, and within that fish tank, you'll have fish. In our case, it's shrimp that we grow, and then on top of the shrimp, you have some plants that grow. In our case, it's heirloom tomatoes. And the way that it operates is that the excretion is basically the poop from the fish, or in our case, the shrimp. That when they poop, they excrete and goes into in the tank. Though that poop is filtered out of the tank and is used to fertilize the plants the heirloom tomatoes are growing on top. And then the heirloom tomatoes, when they're exhaling the oxygen, they inhale carbon dioxide, they exhale oxygen. That oxygen is filtered back into the water to be able to filter the water to make sure that the shrimp are able to still continue to breathe, right? So it creates a symbiotic relationship between the shrimp and the tomatoes, so they can sustainably grow with each other. To my knowledge, this hasn't been done on like a commercial scale, so we're in the process of building that out. We bought like a trucking tanker to be able to scale this out and make it very, very large. And we're in the process of actually building out that material to be able to grow the shrimp and the heirloom tomatoes, and eventually be able to sell those as well. And of course, doing it in a cooperatively owned methodology.
So when you first began your response, you kind of talked about how like Georgia doesn't recognize cooperatives. Um, and that does really bring me to the next question, which is like obviously, like I mean, you even said at the end with the aquaponics like method. Now it's not necessarily cooperative exclusive, but we use it in our cooperatives. There are a lot of barriers to doing the type of work that is done within CMB's cooperative work. So I just wanted to know, what are some of the barriers to building cooperatives in Georgia? And this includes both legal and financial barriers that might exist.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could go on and on about barriers. It's not an easy thing to do, right? Um, One I can just talk about from like the legal and accounting side is that you really need to be able, like, again, like I said, Georgia doesn't recognize cooperatives, which means that you have to be able to go through what more typically people will go through, like an LLC model, right? Where you have an LLC, and then the people who are the worker owners of the cooperative might be the partners of the LLC. But then even that gets a little tricky when it comes to also, percentages of ownership, right? Or decision making practices and whatnot, and all those different types of things and complexities. And honestly, what you really need to have like a to be able to kind of dice through all of the legal side of things, um, developing the bylaws, all of those types of stuff. You really need to have like a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, but a lawyer that specializes in cooperatives, to be able to escort you through that process to make it legally make sense in this within the state, but then also be able to. And you also need like a accountant that deals with cooperatives to be able to make it make sense when you have to report your books too. Because again, while we're trying to build these separate systems for it to be, I mean, you have to be able to. We're doing this within the confines of, unfortunately, it's capitalist state. So we have to be able to figure out how best ways to be able to do that, right? So um, it's not saying it can't be done. It just has a lot of challenges and a lot of like logistical hardships and paperwork and all the type of stuff that you have to fill out to be able to do that. But that's part of the work of organizing and building these things out, right? So you have to be able to we have to be able to make these things happen, and we have a good network of folks who are movement lawyers, or who are folks who are experienced and have put their life or dedicated their lives to being able to build out these alternative forms of economics that we can utilize to be able to, in this transitionary phase, to be able to get rid of capitalism and survive while we're still doing it. So that's on the legal side, right? I think on the other side, some of the challenges that we have as far as just building these out, just not to be too like not it's not really theory, but like when we talk about worker-owned cooperatives, right? People oftentimes, when you talk about it with different people, especially if they're new to the politics, they think, oh, this is great. This is what we need to be striving on for and putting all of our work towards. And it is, I think, something we need to be putting more effort into when we're talking about building alternative systems. But that's also not the end all be all, right? If everything was a worker-owned cooperative, that wouldn't be necessarily liberation, right? And also, particularly when you're talking about building out cooperatives in um, a country like the United States, who relies on the exploitation of other and extraction of resources of the global South in particular, right? So talking about the CMOS in particular, for example, right? Most of the CMOS doesn't grow, in the United States, right? So it's still being we're still purchasing it from, usually it's in the Caribbean, right? Sometimes you can find it on the African continent, but in different places on the African continent, but we're still getting it from other locations, right? So one of the challenges is, we truly want this to be liberation, or a movement towards liberation. It can't just be we're still wholesale purchasing, in a typical capitalistic model, and then just building out cooperative for people that live here in the United States, right? I feel like that's a trap that a lot of people who start building out cooperatives, particularly that are product oriented and not service oriented, kind of fall into, is that, if for it to truly be a cooperative that could kind of combat some of the worst parts of capitalism and imperialism, you have to be able to really try to strive to make it an end-to-end supply chain cooperative, right? So where you're sourcing it, how do we get the people that we're actually sourcing the products from to be involved within the cooperative as well, right? And also then thinking about who we're selling it to, right? We're a wholesaler, right? So are we selling it to who are we selling it to? And are we selling it to local stores, or are we selling it to big commercial stores that are exploiting their employees, right? And they're not cooperatively based, right? So like one of our suppliers is a cooperative, Sevenanda, in Atlanta. So they're a cooperative grocery store, but there's those contradictions that you have to deal with, and being able to think through how to make it make sense if you're trying to build this out to be a really a step towards liberation.
Jessica Gordon Nimhard's book, Collective Courage, goes through the history of cooperatives and collective strategies to survive and thrive in the U.S. by Black people. Economic cooperatives aren't new to Black freedom movement, since Black people have always faced economic disenfranchisement and discrimination. Because of this, many have sought to form cooperative businesses, whether it be retail, distribution, consumer co-ops. Black folk have seen their destiny in cooperating. So what is a cooperative? A cooperative is an institution or business run collectively by its members for collective needs or profit. The idea behind cooperatives is mutuality and communal uplift. The cooperative movement hasn't only focused on just pure business and economics. Many cooperatives work side by side with unions and socialist populist movements of the late 1800s. The Knights of Labor, who at the time was an interracial labor federation, also formed cooperatives. The idea of pooling resources together and forging a collective economic destiny was also present during the early 1900s. The UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, and African Communities League, founded by Marcus Garvey, set up joint stock companies. These weren't worker-owned cooperatives, but they saw the need for collective work and money to move Black people forward. W.E. Du Bois created the Negro Cooperative Guild, which educated Black people on the cooperative economics. Nimhard writes, Du Bois saw the African American community as faced with a choice. We unwittingly stand at the crossroads. Should we go the way of capitalism and try to become individually rich as capitalists? Or should we go the way of cooperatives and economic cooperation where we and our whole community could be rich together? The Young Negroes Cooperative League was also a cooperative support organization. Civil rights activist Ella Baker was a co-founder and president of the YNCL. Cooperation Jackson is a continuation of this legacy in its modern form. Community Movement Builders is currently in the process of building worker-owned cooperatives. We understand that we must build as we fight. Cooperatives play a part in the movement for Black freedom by providing jobs, promoting cooperation, and funding initiatives.
Big dog boss shit. Yeah. This one is called Armageddon. That's what I'm gonna call this one Armageddon. Look. This is for my trans folks and envies, for my Black girls. This is for my dark-skinned friends, for my fat girls. This is for my gay Black men who feeling different. This is for my folks who ain't defined by the system. This is for my folks who ain't got a visible disability. Don't know the difficulty that come with that. Niggas be expecting you to just function a certain way, but I'm wired different under this cap. Hey yo, why these niggas hating us? Individuals, all the girls wanna do is be a crystal gem, you hoe. Be a plant mom to a carton, I can't stop once started. Pick up a book and read before that head of yours hardens on the honor roll. Niggas shame sex workers, but I honor hoes. Cause if it wasn't for the motherfucking dollar, bro, no telling where you would be. Hey yo, fuck this whole system, man, patriarchy, let's go. I hate you so much right now. I can't stand your sight or sound. I'm hype and I can't.
Yeah, definitely. So the land, Weelani Forest, where Cop City is proposed to be built, is surrounded by neighborhoods, the majority of which are working class neighborhoods that are majority occupied by Black residents. Now, most of these neighborhoods are outside of the official city limits of Atlanta, right? They're in unincorporated DeKalb County. They're right next to the city of Atlanta, but they've been intentionally left out of the city of Atlanta through a series of negotiations that incorporated some areas into the city over many decades in the 20th century, but left other areas out of the city of Atlanta, right? And this is important to understand because these neighborhoods being left outside of the city means that the kind of normal so-called democratic practices within the city that would kick in when a proposal like this came up, they didn't kick in for DeKalb County, right? We don't have the same kind of democratic processes. So there was no necessity of any kind of community oversight. And we think this is really intentional. This is why the city of Atlanta and the Atlanta Police Foundation chose this land to build Cop City so that we couldn't have community oversight. Because what I found being a resident there and talking to my neighbors is that the majority of people who live here in this area do not support Cop City being built. And they definitely don't support it being built in the forest and destroying acres and acres of forest to do so, right? But we had no forum to express our dissent. And all of the forums that they created to apparently express dissent were basically nonsense. They weren't real because they were Zoom meetings where our video and our audio was not allowed. All we could do was type in a chat. And if we typed anything in the chat, the people running those meetings would kick us out. So, for instance, I typed once, this is a clear instance of environmental racism. And I was kicked out of the meeting, right? I didn't curse. I wasn't inappropriate. I wasn't rude. I just called it out for what it was. And they removed me from the meeting. And lots of nearby residents were experiencing the same kind of anti-democratic, shutting down of any dissent. So those are the neighborhoods we live in, right? They're outside of the city of Atlanta, majority working class, areas that are majority occupied by Black residents that have been historically disinvested. And this is really important. This is why we think that this land in Weelaunee Forest was able to be owned by the city of Atlanta and then rented out to something like the Atlanta Police Foundation in the first place, because this forest has been really disinvested, meaning that they've allowed it to serve as a dumping ground for pollution, for like used tires and stuff, right? But also right here in this area feeding into the forest, there's a massive waste treatment plant that has been polluting into Entrenchment Creek for several decades. And DeKalb County is aware of this, right? But they haven't stopped it. In fact, this waste treatment plant was supposed to be phased out by 2020. Now it's 2022. And this waste treatment plant is still there. It's still polluting Entrenchment Creek, where there's super high levels of E. coli, which are really dangerous for surrounding residents, but it's still polluting. Another example of disinvestment is there's multiple carceral facilities right there in the forest on the edges. For instance, there's like a kid jail, right? A youth detention facility or whatever. I call it a kid jail. There's a transitional facility, which is for people transitioning out of prison or whatever. And, the people that are caged in those facilities also have been exposed to those high levels of pollution. They've also been exposed to kind of constant gunshots from this police shooting range that is currently in Weelaunee Forest. The police shooting range, it's used by at least APD, but we think multiple departments are using it, where they practice shooting, I kid you not, at a yellow school bus, like a kid's school bus. And those gunshots we can hear all the time, any time of day, any time of night. They're supposed to follow some kind of rules around it, but they don't. They shoot whenever they want to. And the people who are caged in the kid jail, in the transitional facility, they can hear those gunshots all the time too. So they're kind of constantly exposed to that reminder of state violence, while they're also trapped in state violence being in those facilities, right? So the neighborhoods themselves, I mean, it's full of beautiful people, right? But what we're being exposed to between the reminder of state violence with a gunshot, having these carceral facilities there, right, which I consider the people there neighbors, right? Those are our neighbors that are exposed to violence. And then we have the waste treatment plant polluting into Entrenchment Creek. And Entrenchment Creek, for folks who don't know, it feeds into the South River. And this is a vital waterway for the entire region. And it's being heavily polluted by this. And also it's being polluted by the shooting range itself, because you get runoff from the bullets and then there's lead running into the water. So it has E. coli, it has lead, who knows what else, right? And these are all examples of like disinvestment in our community.
Okay, so for the next question, gotta ask, what roles do cooperatives, or which roles have cooperatives played, or should they play, in the movement for Black liberation in general?
That's a great question. I think the way I think about the cooperatives and I think about this in the theory for community movement builders, right? some of our practices, how we organize, is about building out a liberated zone, right? When we say liberated zone, we mean liberated territory where Black people own control, and are able to operate the politics, economics, any kind of safety apparatuses within the community, but any kind of system that touches our community, we want to be able to in control and operate in operation of, right? And so when I think about but we also have to recognize, right, that even in building out a liberated zone, if let's say, we're successful in building out a liberated territory in Pittsburgh, in South Atlanta, the neighborhood in South Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and we build that out, that's not what liberation is, right? It's a step towards liberation, but that in of itself is not synonymous with what liberation is, right? Because that's when you talk about, you have a liberated territory, but how are you going to sustain it if you only have this one little territory and only the Black people in that particular area are liberated? That's not what liberation is. How do we actually use that as a stepping stone to be able to build out liberation in other locations as well, right? Do we use the liberated territories to build out a larger, build out revolution on, not just in a section of the city, but the state, but the nation, but within Pan-Africanism, right? Internationally, right? How do we use it as a model, and how do we use it as a stepping stone to build out liberation in a larger term? And so I think of cooperatives in the same kind of context, right? So if we can figure out ways to be able to develop systems of economics, systems of being able to sustain ourselves by working together, by and doing so outside of an individualistic and a capitalist mindset and the capitalist system, that's a stepping stone to being able to form larger liberation, right? I guess there's more I can say, but I'll leave it there for now.
Definitely makes sense. Like, that is definitely, I agree that really is like the role that it should play. Like, this can be a component and in our movement, and how our struggle could function. But the question is, okay, so you've kind of already gotten into this to a degree, right? It's like you've said that it's just like just having even an entirely cooperative based economy wouldn't necessarily be liberation. So we got to ask the question, like, a lot of people are wondering, and this is more within the organizer or leftist political field, right? Are cooperatives an alternative to capitalism, or why aren't cooperatives an alternative to capitalism? Right. And so I just really wanted to hear your thoughts on that, right? Are cooperatives themselves liberation, or are they not liberation? So, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I think one way I'll answer that is what we're trying to build out is a classless society, right? And the reason why I will say cooperatives are not necessarily liberation is because you can still have cooperatives and still have classes, right? You can still have cooperatives where people have different ownership and different ownership levels, or different parts or different mechanisms of being able to contribute to, even within the confines of one business, right? One cooperative business. The model I just shared, for example, is that, we put from each, I guess, like, every person puts in a particular amount of hours to their job, and they're compensated even based off of those hours, of the profits, right? But that still doesn't eliminate that there could be people that are contributing more than other people to that cooperative, and so it still could create classes within the business structure, right? There's still ideas around management within the cooperatives as well, right? So there's still elements of, a class-based society even within cooperatives. Taking outside of just within one particular cooperative, one particular business, you also have, what if you have industries, right? There's a cooperative, like, let's say every barbershop was run based off a cooperative, and just like every I don't know, oil industry. The oil industry was basically completely ran off of cooperatives, right? Within the oil industry, if that was ran off of cooperatives, it would still create much of a lot of imbalance between different types of industries of how cooperatives would actually, manifest themselves. So even just looking at it from an economic standpoint, it still breeds a lot of, and it can breed a lot of inequality. So again, it's not an end all be all. It's not a result. It's a means of us to be able to get to something that looks more like what we're going to be establishing when we through a revolutionary process.
That's absolutely perfect. Exactly. Like there's a lot of aspects of cooperatives which like kind of still, I'm saying can manifest some of the problem of capitalist society. It's just like, and yet it's just like there is still a role that they can have within the process, which does bring me to my last question for you. And it is really, how can revolutionaries use cooperatives as a part of the process to get rid of capitalism?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the biggest things, and this is when we're building, particularly because, for us, we're building out liberated zone, right? So people that we are trying to recruit to become part of cooperatives, right? Nobody's heard of what a cooperative is. Like most people, like maybe people on the left might be familiar with what a cooperative is, but we're not talking to people on the quote unquote left. We're talking about people generally. And most people don't know what a cooperative is. And so there's a process of being able of education, be it political or otherwise, economic, whatever it might be, like of education about what is a cooperative, why is it a model that you would want to participate in, all of those different types of things. How is it different from capitalism? How is capitalism even exploitative, right? Why are we not trying to do it in the capitalistic model, right? So like there's a lot of education and pretty much organizing that goes into establishing what cooperatives look like. And one of the biggest things I think, one of the most beautiful things about, I think, building out cooperatives, particularly in the context of building out a liberated zone, is that it's another touch point for that political education, right? It's another touch point to be like, hey, this individualistic model that we have been bred within isn't sustainable for us as a community. And what is more sustainable for us as a community is being able to work with one another to be able to, make sure that we all have the things that we need. That we're all being treated, equally, fairly within this. I shouldn't say equally, but fairly within this society, equally as well. But so I think that a lot of it, like, is a part of the significance of building out cooperatives is also just the identification that capitalism is evil at its core, but then also saying, oh, and by the way, you can talk all that shit if you want about how capitalism is evil, like how it's exploitative inherently, how it underdevelops the third world, quote unquote. But what it doesn't, but if you can't offer any kind of solutions, you lose people eventually. And so, but cooperatives does offer a tangible solution, quote unquote, but a tangible offering to be able to say, here's something that we can do to build while we're trying to hold the revolution. This is something that we can do right now in the immediate that can counter that. So.
Okay, so while I said that was the last question, I do want to say, like, did you have any kind of like final thoughts or things that you just really feel like you need to get out there about cooperatives in general, or the CMB cooperatives, or anything of that sort? Is any last thoughts?
One thing I'll say is really stressing, and I think I've done this a little bit throughout, but really stressing that, again, building out a cooperative isn't the end all be all, but it has to be part of, even if you're just thinking about just a cooperative, right? There's been research on this as well that's been done, that like building out a single cooperative, not only is it ineffective as far as like a general just like way of being able to survive as a business, it's also not effective as like as the organizing goals that we have, right? So when we're talking about the reason why it's so important that we're building out, like within community movement builders, we're building out a liberated zone, is that speaks to like the necessity for not just one cooperative, but a network of cooperatives, right? And I alluded this to a little bit earlier, that you can't just have a cooperative business. You also need cooperative lawyers, right? You need a cooperative accountant. You also need to have a base of people who are going to be advocating for cooperatives. You have to have and participating within cooperatives, right? And you have to. So there's also there's different types of cooperatives too. There's cooperative ownership of people that purchasing from a store, for example, right? There's a lot of different things that go into it. But the point that I want to stress is that cooperatives are not the end all be all. You need to be able to have organizing that goes around with it. And what we're organizing around is not just making a cooperative business flourish. We're organizing around liberation, and cooperatives are an ingredient towards that end.
That's absolutely perfect. Thank you, Kwame. So this was just like a description of, seeing these cooperatives and like the whole theory and ideas behind working or making the use of cooperatives within the context of organizing in general, and how they can contribute to the Black liberation movement. And that's basically that.
Perfect. Appreciate you having me on.
Appreciate you too.
All right. Peace, everybody.
All right. Peace.
Community movement builders is Black.
Liberation.
Awesome.
Educational.
Everything. Sustainability.
Revolutionary.
Black.
Self-determination.
Community.
Family.